Phil is a senior director of engineering at Seatgeek, where he leads the team that builds the live events platform used by 44 million people worldwide. Before Seatgeek, he has led the platform team at Meetup, or WeWork, Word on LinkedIn, Linkerd, sorry, not LinkedIn, the pioneering service mesh, and headed product engineering for DigitalOcean and SoundCloud, both pioneers in the adoption of microservices architectures. He will go through his real-world experience with modern monolithic architectures for DigitalOcean, WeWork, and Seatgeek. We will discuss how the assumption of simplicity has failed them and some strategies to keep your sanity when steering a large code base contributed to by hundreds of engineers. So Phil, the stage is yours with the presentation, Monoliths Are Simple and Other Lies We Tell Ourselves.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Let me display my screen. Okay. I'm assuming people can see my screen. All right. Thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to be at Craft, even if not really in person this time around. I really love Budapest. Can't wait to go back to Europe. But as we get here, like the introduction was kind of spot on in describing what we're going to talk about. And what we're going to talk about is, to be honest, my own personal experience, a very selfish thing. I have been working with what we generally call microservices for a very long time. The biggest example was at SoundCloud, but even prior to this, I was a consultant for ThoughtWorks for many years. I worked with, the usual suspect, James Lewis, Sam Newman, Martin Fowler, and we had a lot of projects that were kind of doing what we now call microservices, but back in 2008, 2009, we didn't really use that word that much. And at the same time, the industry has adopted fully this paradigm. There's a lot of interesting things going on that way, but there's a lot of things that happen on the other side of the spectrum as well. And that's a little bit of what I want to discuss with you, because that's the situation I find myself at the moment right now, since at least 2019, when I joined Seatgeek, and even prior at WeWork a little bit. And I want to talk about my, coming from a more kind of heavily distributed application architecture like microservices, what does that mean to work in a more monolithic application? And the first thing I really want to start off with is, let's start with what most of us agree. I have found only one person in the industry that doesn't agree with this with this statement that I'm going to make. And there's one out of way too many for me to consider these relevant numbers. So I'd say most people would agree with one thing, that whatever you're doing, you should really consider starting with the monolith. So Martin wrote this article, 6 years ago, I didn't even realize it was that old, where he basically puts the case forward that there's very little reason for a small company who's like starting something, or to be honest, an initiative inside a larger company, to start off straight with microservices. There's a lot that happens in a company, and not a lot of it is related to the technology side of things. Sometimes it is, but there's business uncertainty, you verifying a product, trying different ideas, all this kind of stuff, and going down microservices path from the get-go will probably just distract you. Obviously, if you take a monolith and just assume they're going to be using this forever, you will find some interesting challenges in the future. But to be honest, like most companies won't even get there. Most companies I've been to, most companies I've consulted, most companies I advise to this day, there's a few companies I advise on the side. They usually pivot, fold, something happens before they even get to a point where this decision of monolith first is a problem. But then the question is, what happens to the few who survive and grow? And I think that's an important question, because nobody should join a company thinking that, oh my God, this is not going to go well. This is going to not be successful. We want to make it successful. We work sometimes long hours. We put a lot of effort, a lot of dedication to make it successful. So preparing for failure is sane and a good idea, but we also need to prepare for success. So what happens when a company gets to a point where questions around architecture, monolith, microservices start popping up? Well, after 10 years having a very similar presentation where I would introduce you to the fantastic world of microservices, now I've seen a trend since maybe 5 years ago, probably about the time that article was published by Martin. And I think it can be summarized into this kind of tweets. It's a little snarky. It's like Simon Brown, who I love, and it's like, he's British, so you know how snarky British people can be. But even DHH, which before being canceled for whatever happened at Basecamp that was not amazing, he was pushing forward this idea of majestic monoliths that some people adopt as a term. There's all these running jokes about why people think that microservices is a good idea. And I think that this could be summarized in this kind of quote that I put together, copy and pasting a few different ideas. The principle or the idea I understand these people have is that, hey, if you're having trouble building and managing one application, why do you think you can build and manage 100 applications? It's just like, this doesn't make sense, right? What's the situation here? How does that work in people's head? It's more applications to manage, more applications to maintain, version, things will break, all this kind of stuff. Well, I think that's a good question, and one needs to really think about that. But then how come when you look at companies that adopt microservices, they end up, the bigger one end up in a situation like this? So this is 3 screenshots from 2 different companies that have had monoliths in the past. The first one is the one I want to talk about, exactly the one on the right, SoundCloud. I was at SoundCloud for 5 years. I run product engineering for SoundCloud. I kind of was a champion that migrated from a big Rails monolith to microservice architecture. And one of the things we had when I joined 2011, so probably just after this blog post was written, is this thing called Large Hydro Migrator. And what it did is our database was so big, we had one database, well, like multiple nodes, like replica and canonical for MySQL. And every time we had to perform any kind of data migration was a nightmare. So we created a tool that kind of made it easy, but we had to maintain the tool, and it was a lot of work. And it's funny because when we migrated to microservices, we didn't have to use this tool anymore, but we realized that a few people using, including the Shopify, which is on the left-hand side here. But Shopify was sending patches to us, and we basically said, guys, this is great. It seems like this is really useful to you. Why don't you take this project yourselves? Because we don't have this issue anymore. We now have smaller databases that we maintain well, and we can use commodity migration tools like Flybase and all this kind of stuff, even Rails migrations. We don't need this kind of technology anymore. And then talking about Shopify a little bit, being known for being a big monolithic application architecture, they do have a lot of tools and internal things they had to build. One of them is interesting to me is this merge queue thing that help them coordinate all the pull requests coming through. You might remember something similar many years ago from Etsy, who I don't know right now, but at that stage, like 2013 maybe, was a heavy PHP monolith, had a lot of tooling like this. And then in the bottom is my absolutely favorite of all time. It's how Facebook had to, they talk about how they had to scale Mercurial, which is their version control system, similar to Git, so that it would serve the thousands and thousands of developers they have. My favorite part about this work, and I don't know if this work is current, but this was, I don't know, 2017. My favorite thing about this work is that they had to use memcached to cache code to get to people's machine. So it's a lot of work, and there's a whole, a lot of things that they need to do to make this monolith idea work for them. And it goes further. So Facebook has iterated so much on like building their own PHP virtual machine, then building their own language on top of that virtual machine because they figure out the PHP was not a good idea for what they're trying to do. We have Dropbox, which now has kind of moved away from Python, as I understand. But back in 2014, they were a big Python monolith, and they had to create their own Python implementation because they figured out that the stock Python implementation wasn't really working. And then another favorite of mine is how it's a very kind of sassy TechCrunch headline from many years ago, 2008. But the Twitter story was a funny one. Twitter, it's really easy to scale the monolith, was a meme until it actually just blew up and it had to be replaced with microservices. So I like to propose right now Calcado's second law of microservices. It's not the first law because I think I can come up with a more like a cooler law to be the first one. So I made this second one. Basically, every successful company building on monoliths will eventually fork the language and/or runtime and/or tools. So if you start a monolith in Java, in Ruby, in whatever language you pick, at some point you're successful. You have a team on the side that basically works solely on building tools and runtimes of virtual machines, interpreters for that programming language so that you can scale further. But then it's, I can hear in my head all of you saying, but that's because it's companies that have massive scale, right? Out of those, I have only worked for SoundCloud. And yes, when I left, we had about 300 million monthly active users. Everything would break all the time because, Britney Spears would release a single or whoever, and then we would have massive traffic spikes. So this is reality. This happens to large scale companies. But the challenge here or the thing is, I wish that was actually the case. I wish that was true that only large scale companies have this problem. And let me tell you a little bit of an example that's closer to my current situation at Seatgeek. So I believe we probably have a very mixed audience right now, but most probably centered in Europe. The Seatgeek brand is not so strong in Europe. We do actually have products, especially in the UK. So if you go to like the West End to a show or a Premier League football game, you are likely to be using Seatgeek software, but we don't really have a consumer brand, so the logo is not as well known as it is in the US. But basically, we do two things. We work in the primary market, secondary market for tickets. What that means, primary markets, everything that goes from box office management, inventory management, all the way to somebody scanning a ticket to get into some venue. We have a lot of clients on this space in the US. We do a few NFL teams, lots of NBA teams. And basically that means that, we need to fill in a 100,000 people stadium in 30 minutes before an NFL game starts. And we have the secondary side, and the secondary side is more brokers who sell tickets online. So you bought in bulk and you want to sell retail, or people who want to, you cannot go to an event anymore. You want to put your event up for your ticket up for sale so that somebody can get. That's kind of the two business we have inside the company. And we process a lot of money. We have a lot of very big clients in our industry, but we're not that big. Actually, we're about 100 engineers total. We have people spread across Europe. We have people in Denmark, Berlin, Spain, the Netherlands, the UK, in engineering, like outside the rest of the company I don't even know. And a huge presence in Israel, and then kind of all over the US, South America. We're kind of spread out, but we're still just 100 engineers. When I joined SoundCloud, we were about 40 people, 10 engineers. When I left, it was about 250 engineers. DigitalOcean was kind of the same numbers as well. So it's a small organization for what I'm used to. And we have one interesting peculiarity is that we have two monoliths. So I was talking about the two different parts of our business, the consumer side or the secondary market and primary market. We call it consumer and enterprise internally. The enterprise side or the primary, let me start with the other one. The secondary market is how Seatgeek was born. This was our first business, how the company worked for, 5, 10, 6 years of its beginning. And that's one Python monolith that worked very well for this particular team. And then when we decided to get to the primary market, so the business side of things, we acquired a company in Israel, and this company also had with their own monolith. And it's a very interesting. There's a whole other things that I could talk about how to run these two different monoliths, because one is Python cloud native, the other one is classic.NET running on Windows that we had to lift and shift, put on AWS, and I was working heavily on making it cloud native. But this is the general situation we have. I like to refer to it as a binary star system. It's like a good Star Trek reference, but also a model that I think works in your head. But most of what I'm going to talk about today is about the Python side of things, where we have done more progress so far. So the first thing I want to say is okay, we have 100 engineers, 2 monoliths, so let's say 50 per monolith, if you will. How come codebase hygiene is so hard? So this is an email I sent in 2019, a little after I joined. And it basically says, hey, there's more than 100 open pull requests. Some of them are from 2 years ago. A lot of them are from people who don't even work here anymore. Can we please go and clean up all these pull requests by this date? Now, I will admit that I picked a very bad date, like the day after Christmas. In Europe, it's even worse than in the US, because the US, we have Christmas and Thanksgiving are two big holidays, so it's not as uniform the way people take, but not a great date either. But irrespective, I tell you that by that date, actually, to be honest, by January 1st, almost no pull requests had been closed. Granted, people on holidays, but also they just didn't see that as a big deal. And I had to go task to task and talk to people, reach out to people in Slack and try to get, hey, can we please clean up this stuff? So I show you an email from 2019, and I wish I could say it's because we solved this problem, but that would be a lie. It's because I gave up. I just don't, every now and then I go into the pull request queue. We use GitLab, so with the merge request, I close a few ones that I know are obvious, but at this stage, it's kind of bankruptcy in our pull request line, which is one of the reasons I understand very much why Shopify built that merge queue system they're talking about. There's a lot of things that you would like to make work in terms of workflow. The second thing that is very confusing to me in this whole monolith simplicity conversation is that major changes are really hard. So Seatgeek, when I joined, my first project was to move our monolith from MySQL to Postgres. We got a team together, realized what I had to do, and we penned out a 18 months, 24 months project to make this happen. Caveat, or not caveat, like an aggravant here, is that we were running a very old version of MySQL that wasn't supported anymore. So we really needed to move to something else. And the team decided to move to Postgres instead of just upgrade MySQL. Different conversation. Actually, this is a screenshot from a talk that discusses this. But the only reason we actually have done this, we were able to execute on this stuff, is because COVID. We worked in live events. There was kind of no live events last year. It was a great opportunity for us to accelerate some of these changes. So we got all these people working on migrating the database to focus on this only, and we were able to execute this within 6 months. It was still a lot of work. Again, this presentation is going to be a link. The engineers who actually worked hands-on on the project talk a lot about it, but basically the amount of coordination and even tooling we had to write to figure out how to migrate, what in the database was owned by what, if they can migrate now, when they can migrate, what kind of code changes need to happen, it was insane. And again, I'm used to a world where we can basically swap databases and change the only service that uses it without having to send emails, have meetings, and all that kind of stuff. But then, so major changes are hard, but minor changes are still hard. This graph is actually from either last week or 2 weeks ago. And what happened is that we changed our database servers. We use AWS to benefit from Graviton. So Graviton is AWS new processor. It kind of costs much less. It would be a great impact in our AWS costs to move there. We've been planning this for a while. We decided to do it. It was, I think, on a Tuesday. We've done it. We tested. Everything was okay. Everything was okay for the whole rest of the week. And then on a Sunday, I got paged, and a lot of different people get paged. And it turns out that there was a huge problem with the way we were configuring something, and we just had this massive spike. The site was down. Now, first question, why didn't we figure that out before? Because in our line of business, we have seasonality happens within the week. So during the week, a lot of people are buying tickets, and they go to a few events here and there, sure. But the weekend is where things happen. The weekends when sometimes you have 7 events going on at the same time. And the pattern of use of our monolithic code base in letting people inside a venue or things that you do in the day of the event is very different from the code path that is followed when people are just buying tickets or doing just covering events and doing things like that. We could only detect that problem in the weekend because that's when that kind of slice of the code is used. Now, there's a few different things that we could have done to mitigate this, but the thing that blows my mind is that 1/3 of our system was down, and the whole thing was down. One third of the system was having a problem, and the whole thing goes down because everything is you live together, you die together. And there are ways to deal with this, but they're not very easy, to be honest. Capacity planning is very hard. This is a list of a few of the different pools of APIs. APIs are Python monolith. And the way we do it is because we have different code paths, different modules, if you will, within this code base, we actually need to split them into different deployments. We run Nomad, so these kind of different Nomad pools and allocations and all the stuff. But we basically have one pool of instances that's used only for internal access, another one that's used only for checkout, so commerce kind of stuff, another one for listings. We have heavy on SEO, we need that to be up. And there is, actually there's one that's missing here, which is, oh no, API tickets, which is the one that's probably, it's kind of the Sunday use case. Like it's the day of the event, I need to pull up my barcode, or I want to transfer tickets to my friends who are coming with me, or whatever it is. And this is kind of the way that I remember when I first joined the industry in 2001, we used to do with different application servers and various other things. We would create pool of machines so that we could have a little bit of an easier time doing capacity planning. Whereas in a service architecture, you can just, depending on the service, depending on what you need, you just scale up or down the service that fulfills that obligation. And then, like, upgrades are hard. We talk about like changes and other things, but upgrades are particularly hard. We have been running Python 2 since the beginning of the company. Python 2 has been deprecated fully deprecated, end of life, by 2019 December, I think. So since before I joined the company, has been many different plans, very detailed plans on how we could migrate to Python 3. If you've been to Python 2 to Python 3 migrations, it's always complicated. Instagram has a lot of very interesting blog posts around how they've been migrating their monolithic architecture. But I just like the amount of work in a document like this, listing out every single thing that will go wrong, whatever blocker we have in terms of this library is used only by this team and it doesn't have a Python 3 version, or all this kind of stuff that just doesn't work, is insane. It's a lot of work, and this is just one of the documents we had. Like if I search Python 3 upgrade on my Google Drive, there's a list of different documents written by different people. But we were finally able to execute on this again last year. Immediately after the database migration, we migrated to Python 3. And then immediately we had performance problems that we didn't even know about. And they happened in this corner of the code base or that corner of the code base. It was hard to know what was going on. So we worked on this. I think we've done the Python 3 migration Q3. So by Q4, we were working on this, and we're still working on this up to half Q1. So I had one staff engineer basically fully dedicated to figuring out what was wrong with our performance. And the answer was a very long list of things that we need to do. We're able to get Python 3 to be now faster than what Python 2 was for them. But a small company having to affording a staff level engineer fully dedicated to this, it's pretty bad. It's not, as a manager myself, it's not something I would like to invest my time. And then let's talk about the team. So this is like the original team when I first joined Seatgeek. I got like 2 other people to join me. I think 2 of them in Europe, Lorenzo and Andy, and one Gareth was in the US. This was the team we had when we first started preparing for this stuff. 4 people, not too bad. 100 engineers, 4 people, that sounds good. Well, by now, we have about 12 people working just on tools. So I also manage like the infrastructure teams and AWS and all this kind of stuff. I'm not counting these people. These 12 people we have, which is funny, it's not actually these 12 people represented here because I couldn't find a good team picture. The 12 people we have work just on tools to allow us to both run the monolith and extract things from the monolith when needed. And we're hiring, just like, if that kind of problem sounds cool to you, it is pretty cool. It's different to me. Just click that link. Anyway, so we have this interesting take where people keep talking about how monoliths are simpler, and if you're going for microservices, you're just going to go more complicated. And then I'm here telling you that, well, not only the industry has shown that this is not as simple as it might seem, but also my personal experience in 2 years trying to get these 2 big monoliths going has been pretty bad. The question is like, okay, who's right? Who should I follow? That person? Who's going to give me the answer to my scalability or company growth problems? You already know that the answer is going to be it depends, because it's no sane person will give a presentation on architecture and say the answer is blah and not it depends. It could be blah. But let's explore how we get to it depends. First, let's revisit an old friend. So I mentioned that I love Budapest, I love craft. This is a picture from the talk I gave at CraftConf in 2017. And I must tell you that that room had much more people when the talk actually started. This was the beginning of the talk. So every time I look at this picture, it's like, oh shit, this looks pretty bad. But no, the room was fuller than that. But in this talk, I was trying to use a few different tools to think about why and how to migrate to microservices and when. And the main tool I've used, which is I still like, is this paper that comes from economics, talking about why do people organize into firms, why they organize into corporations. There's a few different articles written about this talk, and I want you to actually replay it because we unfortunately lost the video. But I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But the basic idea is that keeping things within boundaries, a company, or in this case, in our analogy, a monolithic code base, makes sense when the transaction cost of doing something inside the monolith company, whatever it is lower than through a marketplace of agents. So that's basically saying, for a company, I will employ you as full-time employees with benefits and all this, because I assume that it's going to make it cheaper and easier for us to work together. When I need something done, I can just go to Bob talks to Mary, and it's done. Whereas imagine that you go on one of those freelance websites, 99 Designs, this kind of stuff, and you just hire people through this kind of marketplace. It's a lot of overhead on you. There's a lot of things that you need to worry about that you wouldn't have to worry if the person was your employee. And it's funny because the worry might not be cost. It might be much easier and cheaper to hire a freelance worker or a network of freelance workers to do your job or to do the work you need, instead of hiring them as full-time employees. But costs like sheer numbers of dollars or euros is not really what matters the most necessarily, especially for growth-based startups. What time tends to be the thing that's the most scarce. So the amount of time you have to invest in whatever overhead and hiring these people, making sure they're doing the right work, all this kind of stuff, it can be much higher if you hire a network of people to work on you. So basically, as long as you can keep the cost of operating within the thing low, you're in a good spot. If that breaks, then you might consider something else. Now, I use these to talk a little bit about microservices. And one thing I didn't really define during that talk is what transaction costs mean. I wanted to keep it more abstract so that people could, take that different ways. But I think that this can help us understand why this difference of thought exists between these two people. So basically, I think the people pushing for more monolithic architecture, people pushing for more microservices, whatever architecture, they probably have different ideas of what the transaction cost means to them. What does this word means when I'm applying this in practice? And these school of thoughts, I think we can think of them in like basically two ways. Model and monolith people, which is Simon Brown's word that I like, it seems to be really focused on what happens inside the code base. So I'm going to write very high quality code. I want to make sure that it's performant because all the same objects and data structures are in memory at the same time. I want the user experience to be great, like open an IDE, if you open IntelliJ or VS Code or whatever, and I can quickly find where this code is. I can quickly press a button and refactor the whole thing without going through 3-4 different services. All the stuff makes sense to me. I can completely see that. And people on the microservices heavy side of things seems to be thinking about ops, resilience, governance, etc., as part of the transactional cost. This is interesting if you look at folks who eventually became authors and speakers and have contributed to this industry a lot, to like the microservices side. They usually have an ops heavy background that they have been involved in the DevOps movement and all this kind of stuff more than the kind of more object-oriented design, functional programming, all those kind of things. I think this is one interesting split. Like the ops heavy folks, DevOps people who are always conscious, always thinking about the last mile of a system lifecycle when it's in production. They tend to prefer more distributed architectures, and others tend to prefer model monolith. Also, this is just my opinion. I might be completely wrong, but that's one interesting tool that I think to find to make a decision around what to do next. And the answer is, to me, a lot of what happens at tech companies is really, it's not about right, it's about right now. And this is kind of a very kind of blunt and open slogan and meme, but I think it's really focused on a few things. And let's talk about the caveats on this one. Geez, the first thing is you need to know what's the business strategy and make your architecture enable it now and going forward. So when I say right now, I don't mean today. I mean, oh, right now we have 5 people and let's just build whatever works for these 5 people. You need to look a little forward, talk to your business folks, understand what's growth looking like, what part of the business there's going to be more churn, more experimentation, what part of business is more solidified, and play with that. So now, right now, needs to be a little further. And the second one is something that I'm suffering with right now. There's a lot of tooling and literature and open source software around operating microservices, not so much a monolith. So basically, every company I've listed before, when I had those screenshots about the tools they've built, they've written extensively about how they build their own monoliths. Unfortunately, this is not so much for smaller companies. You don't see a lot of smaller companies talking about that because usually they either too small or too big. Like the mid-sized companies that you need, that you probably will be, you don't see a lot of literature around how to go about this. Something that also, and we have a fundamental issue at the moment at Seatgeek, is that extracting microservices is easier than folding back into the monolith. So a badly extracted microservice, something that's not really a service, it does half of a job. You can think of, it breaks the single responsibility principle. It's quite hard to fold back in the monolith. In our case, it's a little worse because people have extracted pieces of the Python monolith into a different programming language, usually Go, sometimes C#. And now to fold that back, that means porting back to Python, or maybe even the ones that are in Python are in different versions of Python, they're still in Python 2. There's a lot of complication to this. So postponing the decision is good because folding things back, if you do it wrongly, is harder than what it should be. And then I'm going on time, but the one thing that it's also talked about in that last, in the 2007 CraftConf presentation, but I think it's still the most important thing is you shouldn't even consider microservices until you have good enough answers to all these questions. This is what we call the prerequisites of microservices. Different people have their list. This is my list. You don't have to have perfect answers to these questions, but you need to know, that you can quickly provision things. You have some basic monitoring. You have some form of standardized RPC. Are we going to use gRPC? Are we going to use JSON over HTTP? What are we doing here? So if you take all these kind of tidbits and a few more into consideration, we get to a point where the phrase really is not about right, it's about right at this growth, right for, that's wrong, for this growth phase. Like I mentioned, SoundCloud is probably the best example I have on this one. When I joined SoundCloud, we had, I actually can't remember, probably 5 to 10 million users. Every month, we would be adding 10 million users to the platform, and things would break and change in different ways. We've pivoted the business so many times that at some point we didn't even remember what the business model was actually supposed to be. So you need to focus on what matters to the company right now, but also keep an eye on where you're going and have like this both pessimistic and optimistic view. You need to have a plan in case you grow and a plan in case you don't. Creating optionality for the business is one of the most important things for software architecture. And basically, again, don't even think of microservices if you don't have this. Work on this first. There's many different ways to get this. A lot of cloud providers can help you with this. A lot of open source software can help with this. But that's what you need before even answer this question. So I'm going to end up on a big it depends. It depends on what you want to do, or where your company is at and what it's going to be. But ultimately, the most important thing to me for you to take out of this conversation is really those previous slides around the challenges that actually exist when building monoliths. It's not as easy as people think it is. It's not as hard as people like me would want to make you believe. It's not for free, and you need to be very aware of how much investment it's going to go, from 4 people to 12 people and all that kind of stuff. And I think I'm over my time, so thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, and that was a great presentation. We have like rain of questions in the Q&A section, so you just cut off a little bit of time from Q&A, but we still have time for a few Really great question. So first of all, I would like to start with the most upvoted question, which is from Zoltan right now. Most of our problems start there when we build an MVP, and the next day it's a feature, and there's no time for talking about microservices, as it makes the process slower. What do you think about it?
The way I understand the question is you try something and then, oh shit, now this should have been a microservice. But now we don't have time and need to keep pulling forward. It's funny you mention that way. I'm more used to this problem the other way around, where sometimes a microservice like, oh no, this actually should be part of a different service. But I've seen this even at Seatgeek recently. We released a feature that we had 3 people and 2 months to build this feature. So these 3 people knew the monolith very well. They just hammered it inside the monolith. That was good. That worked so well. The feature is growing to a level we want to extract it to a service. I think the one thing I didn't want to talk too much about, because it's a 30-minute presentation, is how to structure your monolith so that it can be easily carved out later. There's a few interesting things you can do in terms of modularity and other stuff. Shopify actually has a lot of interesting articles on this. But my suggestion would be, instead of trying to, if this happens, and you can see this going forward, instead of trying to think of this feature by feature, see if you can slice some amount of time with an iteration or whatever you can get from your, between business priorities and all that stuff, but to create a structure that allows your monolith to be split easier in the future. And this oftentimes means just a good module system. In Rails, there's something that people do where they actually create many different Rails applications within one. I think that's pretty much what Shopify does. Python's a little more confusing because there's no strong concept of modules, but that's basically what I think it is. In the Java world, my head would always be, you might have one code base. Think of it like a deployable being a jar or WAR file, but you should really treat that as many different modules inside your system, so that it become eventually easy to move out. And also be really careful with dependencies within the code base. So make sure that there's very good understanding of what inside your code base, what things are meant to be reused by other modules and what things are internal, because this is one of the biggest problems we have.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot for your answer. And the next question is from Fabian. What's a good break-even point with regards to number of engineers for switching from a monolith to microservices?
Good. I don't know if the number of engineers would play such a big role. I think it's the way that I like to think about microservices is more like, where's your business going? And kind of model the services around that, kind of a little bit of domain-driven design. But in more kind of practical, dry terms, I think it's going to be very hard. It starts getting very hard when you get to the north of 20 people. It's just it's kind of all these laws about communication and how people behave. The less people know each other, the more arguments you're going to have. I actually faced something similar to this when I was working for Linkerd. It was an open source project, and we decided for a monolith design for the service mesh, but we would get a lot of pull requests because it's open source. And the team that was working on Linkerd knew exactly, we were maybe 6 people, knew exactly what goes where and what's the style, but every pull request would come and be completely out of whack with our standards. So we had to spend a lot of time coaching people on this. So I'd say like north of 15, 20 people is where I think starts getting funny. But I don't know how much this correlation holds. It's just like my instinct tells that, but I don't know if I wouldn't bet on that.
We have one more question from John. Is modular monolith viable long term? In my experience, if people can break module boundaries, they will.
Yeah, so I have the exact same experience. One thing that I think I miss is from my back, enterprise Java days. I don't hate Java, I actually love Java very much, but enterprise Java days was a different case. And we had a tool, I think the tool is called Macker, where it's similar to check style, but a little more enforcing, where you could say this package cannot talk to that package, or this package can only talk to this package. And we built something like this for Rails at SoundCloud back in the day, but I never saw a tool that actually does this well for other tools. But I think this is one of the ways to go about this. Again, especially now we are so distributed more than we used to be. Have a tool have the talk. You don't want to be, especially as a more senior person in organization, architect, director, whatever you are, you want to go, hey, junior engineer who just got here 5 minutes ago and is terrified of everything. I would like to talk to you about this thing is not good and that other thing. If you can automate this conversation, it always works better in my experience.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and I think it's from someone. What do you think about GCP or AWS, where less DevOps-oriented developers can write their projects with microservices? Do you recommend them?
So I'm interpreting this to be like the kind of platform as a service products these folks have. I actually do recommend it. I don't have a lot of experience with GCP in besides like building tools for them. On AWS, there's a lot of very interesting things that you can do with like way less DevOps heavy things. One thing I'm going to tell you is that Lambda is not one of them. We use Lambda extensively at Meetup. It's a fantastic project. We're actually using Lambda right now at Seatgeek, but it does require a fair chunk of DevOpsy things in general, like SRE and other things. It will get better, but right now it still requires a lot. But you talk about Beanstalk and all this kind of more higher level things, I think it works pretty well. Everybody, if only we all could go back to Heroku, that would be much happier. So there's anything that looks like Heroku I'm a big fan of.
Okay, that's good. I think we have time for one more question from Istvan. Building microservices without proper knowledge can easily turn into a Death Star pattern. What would you recommend to avoid it?
That's a good one. I think the first thing is to establish what's principle, what makes something a microservice. And there's no need to go into too much philosophy around this. Reading books like Domain-Driven Design can give you a good idea. I like always to follow the business. Oops. I like to always follow the business. That's what live TV is hard, man. So I like to follow the business on the kind of design of the microservice, because my hypothesis, and this is way before microservices, I was working heavily on microservices. My hypothesis is always that changes that modify business terms and business concepts. So if you have a new business unit or whatever it is, they are bigger changes and they justify changes in architecture. But small, if your architecture follows the business, you can navigate the same way when you need to refactor something. But it's hard. I think you need a few iterations on that. And the first thing the one thing I think people need to keep in mind is that you're going to get it wrong and you're going to iterate. It's a very empirical process. And at some point you need to get there.
Okay. Thanks a lot for all the questions.